The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the trees. It was the silence. The orchard had always been alive in a quiet, steady way. Rows of fruit trees stretched across the land in careful alignment, each one planted with intention years ago. The soil held memory, the kind that comes from seasons of growth, patience, and consistency. Nothing about it was rushed. Nothing about it was accidental. But that morning, something felt different. The stillness carried weight. The trees were there, exactly as they had always been, branches full, leaves shifting gently in the early breeze, but the atmosphere around them had changed. It felt watched, measured, as if something external had begun to press against the natural rhythm of the land. The first clue came in the form of a notice. It didn't arrive with urgency or explanation. It simply existed, printed and official, placed where it would be seen without effort. The language was structured, formal, and detached, yet the message it carried was anything but neutral. The orchard was in violation. The statement didn't align with reality. The land had been cultivated long before any external authority had taken interest in it. Every tree had been planted within clear property boundaries. There were no shared spaces involved, no encroachments into neighboring areas. The orchard was not an expansion. It was not new. It was established, stable, and entirely within its defined limits. Yet the notice suggested otherwise. It framed the orchard as something out of place, something that disrupted a standard that had been imposed from outside the land itself. It reduced years of growth to a single classification, non-compliant. That classification carried consequences. Not immediate destruction, but something that pointed toward it. A direction. A process that, if allowed to continue unchecked, would lead to the removal of what had taken years to build. The realization settled slowly. Because orchards are not temporary. They are not structures that can be moved or replaced easily. Each tree represents time, care, and continuity. To challenge their existence is to challenge everything that led to their growth. The notice did not acknowledge that. It treated the orchard as a problem. And that was where the tension began. Because the land had always been understood clearly. Its purpose, its boundaries, its identity. Nothing about it had changed. Only the interpretation of it had. And that interpretation now carried authority. The orchard stood quietly, unchanged, but the meaning attached to it had shifted. What had once been a place of growth was now being defined as a violation. And that shift could not remain unexamined. The presence of the notice pointed toward something larger than a single decision. It suggested a system. The HOA had always existed as part of the surrounding structure, maintaining a set of standards designed to create uniformity across the community. Those standards were usually applied to visible elements, paint colors, exterior modifications, landscaping choices that affected shared aesthetics. But the orchard did not belong to that category. It was not decorative. It was functional. It existed not as an extension of design, but as a continuation of land use that predated the current framework. The trees were not planted to conform. They were planted to grow, to produce, to sustain. That distinction mattered. Because systems built around appearance often struggle to interpret spaces defined by purpose. The HOA's perspective likely relied on consistency. A desire to maintain a certain visual order, to ensure that properties aligned with a shared expectation of what the area should look like. In that context, an orchard, dense, productive, and organic, could be seen as deviation. But deviation is not violation. And that difference is where the conflict began to take shape. The documents governing the HOA were structured, but they were also limited. They defined authority within certain boundaries, but those boundaries depended on accurate interpretation. When interpretation extends beyond those limits, authority begins to overlap with assumption. The orchard had been placed within clearly defined property lines. Those lines were documented, surveyed, and legally recognized. They did not intersect with shared spaces. They did not infringe on neighboring properties. They were independent. Yet the notice suggested that independence had been overlooked. That meant one of two things. Either the rules were being applied incorrectly, or the rules themselves were being interpreted in a way that exceeded their intended scope. Neither option supported the notice. And yet, the notice existed. That contradiction created pressure. Not immediate, but persistent. Because once a system identifies something as non-compliant, it does not stop on its own. It moves forward, step by step, toward enforcement. And enforcement, once initiated, carries momentum. The orchard, unchanged in its physical state, had entered a process that did not align with its reality. The question was no longer whether the orchard belonged. It was whether the system recognized that it did. The orchard had never been just wrong wasn't the trees. It was time. It was the silence. Years led into soil. The orchard had always been alive in a quiet, cycles that created something stable. Rows of fruit trees stretched across the land in careful alignment. History. Each one planted with intention years ago. Branches soil held memory, care, the kind that comes from seasons of predictable rhythm, patience, that kind of continuity builds connection. Nothing about it was rushed. Not in a dramatic way. Nothing about it was accidental. Steady sense of ownership and understanding. Different. The land becomes familiar, weight, not just visually, the trees were there, but emotionally, exactly as they had always been. It becomes something that reflects effort, leaves shaping gently in the identity. Breeze. But the atmosphere around them had that connection. It felt physically, measured, but conceptually, as if something introduced doubt into something that had never required them of the land. It suggested that the orchard, despite its history and its placement, didn't arrive with urgency or explanation. Perspective. It simply existed, that idea did not printed easily, and official, because redefining something does not change what it is. The language was structured, the orchard remained what it had always been. Yet the message it carried was anything created a gap between reality and perception. Violation. A space where misunderstanding with reality left unaddressed. The land had been cultivated long before any external authority had taken interest in it, but through clarity. Every tree the emotional response was not immediate confrontation. There were no shared spaces involved, a recognition that something had shifted areas, and that shift required attention. The orchard was not an expansion. Ignoring it would not restore balance. It was understanding it stable, and entirely within they always had limits, unaffected by the notice suggested otherwise. But the meaning attached to them had changed in the eyes of the system, something that disrupted a standard that had been imposed from outside, not because of resistance, but because of years of growth to a single classification, not for the land. That classification carried consequences. The situation did not escalate with noise or confrontation, pointed toward it. Escalated with direction. A process that, the system if allowed to continue unchecked, would lead to the removal of what had taken years systems that rarely paused. The realization settled slowly. The notice had not been an isolated action. They are not structures that can be moved something designed to continue unless it was challenged with equal structure, care, and that realization changed everything. To challenge their existence, ignoring it was no longer an option to their growth. The orchard stood as it always had. Rows of fruit trees treated the orchard as a problem that had supported them through countless seasons. And that was where the tension began. But now it existed because the land had always been understood not from nature, not from its purpose, but from a system that had decided it did not belong. Nothing about that decision demanded response. Only the interpretation of it had. Not reactive, and that interpretation now carried authority. The records were gathered carefully. Stood quietly, property surveys, but the meaning attached to it had boundary maps. What had once been a place of growth was now being defined as a violation. These were not opinions. And that shift could not remain unexamined. They were fixed references. The presence of the land in exact towards something larger than a single decision. And when those documents were placed alongside the claims had always existed as part of the surrounding structure, impossible to ignore. Maintaining a set of the orchard was fully contained within the property across the community. Every tree, those standards were usually applied to visible cultivated land. Paint colors, there was no exterior modifications, landscaping choices that affected beyond defined limits. No justification for the classification that had been applied. It was not decorative. The tension grew not because of uncertainty. It existed not as an extension of design, because once the truth is clear, the presence of contradiction becomes framework. The trees were not planted under an assumption. They were now that assumption stood in conflict with documented reality. That distinction could not remain hidden. Because systems built around appearance often struggle to interpret spaces defined by purpose. And the slow recognition that something within the process relied on consistency. The orchard, a desire to maintain a certain visual order, now stood supported by evidence aligned with the shared expectation of what the area should look like. The pressure shifted. In that context, no longer rested solely on the land. Dense, productive, it moved toward a structure that had misdefined deviation. And that shift marked the beginning of violation. Because systems can resist where the conflict began to take shape. But they cannot ignore clarity. The documents governing the HOA was examined, but the more the situation revealed itself. They defined authority not as a conflict between land and rules, but as a misalignment between interpretation and reality. When the orchard had never violated beyond those limits, authority begins to overlap with assumption. But what emerged next was more subtle and in some ways more significant. The issue was not just that the orchard had been incorrectly classified, legally recognized. It was how that classification had come to exist in the first place. They did not infringe on neighboring properties. They were written with specific intent, yet the notice suggested that certain aspects of property use within the community. That meant one of two things. But those rules relied on categories, on definitions that grouped spaces into recognizable types, in a way that the orchard did not fit neatly into any of them. Neither option was not purely residential landscaping. And yet, the notice was not decorative. That contradiction created pressure. It was functional land, sustained over time. Because once a system identifies something as non-compliant, it does not stop on its own. Instead, the orchard had been interpreted through a lens that did not account for its nature. And it had been treated as something it was not, placed into a category that carried restrictions it was never meant to fall under. had entered a process that did not align with its reality. It was a failure of classification. The question was no longer whether the orchard realization changed the entire structure of the issue. It was whether the system recognized that it did. Because once the correct classification was applied, the violation disappeared completely. There was no partial alignment, no need for adjustment or compromise. The orchard, when viewed accurately, existed entirely within acceptable limits. It had always been compliant, not because it had adapted, but because it had never been outside the rules to begin with. The system had simply misunderstood it. That misunderstanding had created a chain of actions: notice, classification, escalation. But none of those actions had altered the underlying truth. The orchard had remained constant. The error had existed within the interpretation. And once that became clear, the path forward was no longer uncertain. It was inevitable. Because systems, when faced with undeniable clarity, must correct themselves. Not out of concession, but out of necessity. The deeper the documentation was examined, the more the situation revealed itself. The orchard had always been alive and quiet, but as a misalignment between interpretation and reality across the land in careful alignment, the orchard had never violated any boundary with intention years ago. That much was now certain. The soil held memory. But what emerged next was more subtle, seasons of growth, and in some ways more significant, and consistency. The issue was not just that the orchard had been incorrectly classified. Nothing about it was accidental. It was how that classification had come to exist in the first place. The rules themselves had not changed. The trees were written exactly as they had always been, designed to regulate certain aspects of property in the early community. But the atmosphere around them had changed. Those rules relied on categories, on definitions that grouped spaces into recognizable types, as if something external had begun to press against the natural rhythm into any of them. The first clue came in the residential landscaping. It didn't arrive with urgency or explanation. It was not temporary. It simply existed, functional land, printed and sustained over time, placed where it would be seen within its own purpose. The language was distinction had been overlooked and detached. Instead, yet the message it carried was interpreted through a lens that did not account for its nature. The orchard was in violation. It had been treated as something it was not, with reality, placed into a category that carried restrictions long before any external authority had taken interest. This was not a failure of the land. Every tree had been planted within clear property boundaries, and that realization changed the entire structure of the issue. No encroachments into neighboring the correct classification was applied, was not an expansion. The violation disappeared. It was not new. Completely. It was established. There was no partial alignment and entirely no need for adjustment or compromise. Yet the notice suggested otherwise. When viewed accurately, it framed the orchard as something out of acceptable limits, something that disrupted the standard that had been imposed not because it had adapted itself, but because it had never been outside the rules to a single classification. The system had simply misunderstood. That classification, that misunderstanding had created a chain of actions. Not immediate destruction, notice, but something that pointed toward escalation, a direction. But none of those actions had altered the underlying truth. If allowed to continue unchecked, the orchard had remained constant. To the removal of what the error had existed within the interpretation. The realization settled slowly. And once that became clear, because orchards are not temporary, was no longer uncertain. They are not structures that can be moved or replaced easily. Because systems, each tree when faced with undeniable clarity, and must correct themselves. To challenge their existence is to challenge everything that led to their growth. The resolution did not arrive did not acknowledge that. It unfolded through alignment. It treated the orchard as a problem. Once the correct interpretation was recognized and supported because the land had always been understood, the process that had been moving forward began to reverse. Its boundaries, its identity, dramatically, nothing about it had changed, but with the quiet interpretation of it had. The notice was interpretation now carried the classification removed. The orchard stood quietly, the orchard restored to its proper standing, but the meaning attached to it had shifted. Nothing about the land once been a place of growth was now being defined as where they had always been, and that shift could not remain unexamined. The presence of the notice pointed towards something larger than a single that had attempted to redefine. It suggested a system. What changed was the HOA had always existed as part of the surrounding structure, maintaining a set of standards demonstrated how easily systems can move away from accuracy when interpretation were usually applied to visible elements. Even well-structured frameworks, exterior modifications, landscaping choices rely on our applied without full context. But the orchard did not belong to that example of that. It was not. It had not resisted the system. It was functional. It had simply existed outside the assumption of design, the system had but as a continuation of land use. Those assumptions were correct framework. Everything returned to balance. The trees were not planted to conform. The land did not need to be defended. They were planted to grow or confrontation. To sustain. It needed to be understood. That distinction mattered. That understanding restored its place. Built around appearance, but the impact of the situation extended beyond the immediate resolution. The HOA's left behind relied on consistency. That clarity is not optional to maintain a certain visual order, to ensure that properties aligned with a shared expectation of what the area should look like. And in uncertainty, context, when acted upon, creates disruptive and organic. The orchard stood as it always had. Deviation, stable, but deviation unchanged. Is not violation. Defined and by that its difference is where the conflict began to take external perception. The documents and in the end, the HOA was structured, proved stronger, but they were also limited. Because they defined authority within certain boundaries, does not need to argue. But those boundaries simply remain accurate interpretation, and everything else adjusts around. When interpretation extends beyond those limits, authority begins to overlap with assumption. The orchard had been placed within clearly defined property lines. Those lines were documented, surveyed, and legally recognized. They did not intersect with shared spaces. They did not infringe on neighboring properties. They were independent. Yet the notice suggested that independence had been overlooked. That meant one of two things. Either the rules were being applied incorrectly, or the rules themselves were being interpreted in a way that exceeded their intended scope. Neither option supported the notice. And yet, the notice existed. That contradiction created pressure. Not immediate, but persistent. Because once a system identifies something as non-compliant, it does not stop on its own. It moves forward, step by step, toward enforcement. And enforcement, once initiated, carries momentum. The orchard, unchanged in its physical state, had entered a process that did not align with its reality. The question was no longer whether the orchard belonged. It was whether the system recognized that it did.